Leisure Appeal.
All You Need Is Love, Let It Be, and I Want to Hold Your Hand are songs that you know and love by a timeless band, the Beatles. And this week you can hear some of the music recreated for a great cause. I'm now joined by George Harrison's sister Louise and Marty Scott, the man who portrays George Harrison, in their band, the Liverpool Legends. Thank you two for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
Now,
we're very happy to be here.
Louise, first I've got to ask you, how's Marty stack up as George?
Very well, actually.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Oh.
And
Well
you,
said, well
yeah, you're lucky on that one. And you go way, way back with the Beatles. You were telling me earlier you were at the show at the Ed Sullivan Theatre.
Yes, I was also, there even before that, because back in 1963 was when I first moved into this country, and my mum started sending me their singles. And being a bit of a ham myself, I said, okay, kid brothers in show business, started running around all the radio stations and saying, hey, my kid brother's #1 in England, you should be playing them. And I discovered that the music business in this country was totally, totally different than in Britain. Because in Britain, all you need to do is to get onto the BBC. Once your record's accepted there, then the whole country knows about you. But here, back in those days, not as many radio stations as now, but there were about 6,000 individual radio stations. And so, I was trying to get them played. But in the process, I started researching the whole American music market and writing to Brian Epstein and George Martin and Dick James, who was their music publisher, and, filling them in on how the whole business operated over here. And I was also telling them that probably the best showcase for new talent was the Ed Sullivan Show. So,
and then the rest is history.
The rest they say is history.
Yeah.
And you haven't stopped flying around everywhere and getting the Beatles message out.
Absolutely.
Tell us about the tour that the two of you are on right now.
Well, tonight we're going to be playing in Manchester, tomorrow night in Northampton, and on Saturday we'll be at Middleton. And we're doing these shows, we call it Help Keep Music Alive. And the idea behind it is that we know that, the economy is in a bit of a mess. Nobody's getting the kind of funding that they really need. And in particular, of course, the music departments in many schools are being, left behind. So we thought as musicians, it was one thing that we could, one of the problems that maybe we could help to not eliminate, but maybe to help solve a little bit. And especially since back in the 90s, my brother, for the first and only time in his life, made a public service announcement. And that was in conjunction with Mr. Holland's Opus, the movie.
Really?
Yes, and in it he said, music's very important. After all, look what it did for me, and help keep music alive.
Yeah.
So
and that became the name of
our organization.
And you're doing right now. And Marty, to you, why is it so important not only to keep music alive, but Beatles music specifically?
Well, the reason it works so well is we're going into all these high schools and we're performing with the bands and choirs and in orchestras from the schools. So it's the one common denominator these days between the kids and the music directors, because the Beatles are still cool in high school.
Yeah.
And they're still cool in grammar school because Beatles Rock Band is out and it's real popular with 8-year-olds now. And so it's the only group that an 8-year-old could agree maybe with his grandparent on, what I mean? And so it just works, and it's a very exciting. So we're on stage with like 200 kids maybe, and in the audience is all the families and friends. So it's the Beatles. It's a very unique thing. They're the only group in history that has sort of transfers all generations
and all countries
and the music still holds up,
Absolutely.
So.
Yeah, they say it's like sports and athletics is like a universal language that anyone can communicate on. The Beatles is very similar in that way too.
Yeah, if you're growing up and you're a musician or a songwriter, you find it. The Beatles are that great and that good of songwriters and players and singers that it's kind of undeniable if you're a musician that you're going to kind of discover it and like it. And so we're just lucky enough to do them well. It's really the magic of the Beatles that, where it could be 50 years later and we're doing these shows all over the world and it's working and it's snowballing and growing every day,
Now, Louise, take us back in time. What was it like in that exciting time in the 60s with the Beatles and touring with them and being around them?
Well, for me it was a lot of fun because I accidentally ended up being a Beatle reporter, because I had been with the lads in Washington just before we did the Coliseum concert. We were at the British ambassador's home, and while we were there they were having a big fundraiser, charity ball, and they were taking a raffle. And the Beatles had been asked if they would pull out the tickets for the raffle. Well, what happened was there was a teenager there who went up behind Ringo and cut a big chunk off his hair. And so Ringo was very, very angry and went and asked to be taken back to the hotel. Anyway, when I got back to Illinois, where I'd been living at the time, all of the radio stations in that area knew me pretty well. But, of course, they'd ignored my entreaties. But at that time, this whole thing was being on every radio station about what they had was that Lady Ormsby Gore, the British ambassador's wife, had wrestled Ringo to the floor and cut a chunk off his head. This was what was going on the radio all over the country, and I was so upset because, you know, she was a very lovely, dignified lady. And so I called the radio station and I said, hey, you know, you've got to stop that nonsense. It's really bad. And so they said to me, well, you know, you would be in a position to know what's really going on. How about doing reports about the Beatles? So that started. And I was doing reports in probably about 21 major markets all across the country. So, you know, I was very much involved in all of it.
Well, it's going to be a great night of entertainment. I want to thank the two of you for coming and sharing some of these stories with us. And the work that you're doing is tremendous. You're helping to save music education in schools, so I thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
And music education is so important, and if you go to mymassappeal.com, you can find this interview and so much more.